This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Puerto Rico, the U.S. territory that could be on the verge of following Greece and defaulting on its debt. Puerto Rico's government and the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority say they will miss today's deadline for more than $1 billion in payments on a debt of more than $73 billion. In an interview with the New York Times, Puerto Rican Governor Alejandro Garcia Padilla admitted, quote, "The debt is not payable. There is no other option. I would love to have an easier option. This is not politics. This is math." During a televised address Monday, Garcia Padilla announced his plans to restructure the debt.
La meta será lograr una moratoria negociada.
The goal would be to achieve a negotiated moratorium with the bondholders to postpone for a number of years the debt payments in a way so that we could use that money in these years to pay the debt and invest here in Puerto Rico to create jobs and accelerate the economy.
The retired U.S. bankruptcy judge who oversaw Detroit's bankruptcy has now been retained by Puerto Rico. But the island cannot legally file for bankruptcy because it is a Commonwealth. Garcia Padilla called for this to change in Congress.
It is the moment for us to speak at one voice, to demand concrete action from Washington now. Action so that they finish approving the changes to Chapter 9 and so that Puerto Rico can count on the same protection that other jurisdictions have.
Garcia Padilla has already tried to generate more government revenue with a sales tax increase to 11.5% that goes into effect today. He said he would also form a financial team to try and obtain a moratorium on repayments for several years. The team would develop an economic reform that would require legislative approval.
All of this comes as Puerto Rico's unemployment is more than twice the U.S. national rate, and its poverty level is nearly double that of the poorest U.S. state. Meanwhile, Puerto Rico's health care system may also be on the verge of collapse. More than 2 million people, roughly 6% of Puerto Rico's population, rely on Medicare, Medicare Advantage, or Medicaid to pay for their health care. But the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services is set to implement an 11% cut in Medicare Advantage reimbursements for Puerto Rico, costing the island's health care system an estimated $500 million. Well, for more, we're joined by New York Congressmember Nydia Velázquez. She has served in the House of Representatives since 1993. She's the first Puerto Rican woman to be elected to Congress and is the former chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Juan, you wrote a piece in the New York Daily News today. Puerto Rico, like Greece, will default on its debts as the U.S. has ignored the island's financial problems for decades.
Yeah, well, I began my column with an old headline familiar to an older generation, Obama to Puerto Rico drop dead, which is a takeoff on the old headline when Gerald Ford told New York City during its financial crisis 40 years ago that Ford to New York dropped dead. And because the Obama administration has basically said there's no bailout. And I think one of the things I tried to show in my column is that there is a historical context to this. It's been 117 years since the United States took over Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War, occupied the country. And we've seen decade after decade, American companies take huge amounts of profit out of the island. For the first 50 years, it was the sugar barons with their plantations in Puerto Rico. Then the next 50 years, it was the pharmaceutical and the textile companies using Puerto Rico as a tax haven, made it the biggest source of profit to American companies in the world. And now you have the hedge funds and the banks that have been peddling all this debt to Puerto Rico for the last few decades and now are demanding payment before anything else, and of course the Puerto Rican people are an afterthought. So this is the problem, that for 117 years the United States has been milking Puerto Rico, and now it wants to basically say, well, this is your problem. These financial issues are your problem.
So, Congressmember Nydia Velázquez, is Puerto Rico America's Greece?
Well, to some extent, yes. If the bondholders are not willing to come to the table and negotiate an agreement with the Puerto Rican government, Puerto Rico could default. And so my message to the bondholders and hedge funds is that It's not business as usual. They need to come to the table. Puerto Rico cannot, as part of the United States and the federal government, cannot allow for a situation like this to go on. Puerto Rico cannot turn the lights off of the Puerto Rican community in Puerto Rico. This is the time for the federal government to assume its responsibility. They cannot continue to turn their face the other way while all these corporations came to Puerto Rico, reaped profits, and didn't create the type of infrastructure that was needed in order to get economic growth, long-lasting economic growth. And that is the reality that the people of Puerto Rico are facing today. 936, after Section 936 that provided tax preference for American corporations to come and do business in Puerto Rico, and basically there was no oversight mechanism to make sure that the promise that were made happened, and it didn't happen. There was not the type of investment that produced the type of economic growth that was required.
What are the companies?
Well, pharma, the manufacturing sector, they're gone.
And they're gone after the Republicans in Congress eliminated the Section 936
Yes.
benefit, which ended, I think, in 2006, right? So Puerto Rico has been in a population decline and economic collapse since then, right?
The stagnation of the Puerto Rican economy basically started 10 years ago, 2006, and then the housing bust that in Puerto Rico preceded the housing bust here in the United States, coupled with the collapse of the banking sector in Puerto Rico that has not really recovered.
Well, I want to ask you about the role of Congress and the White House. White House spokesman Josh Earnest said Monday that the U.S. is not considering a bailout for Puerto Rico. This is what he said.
There's no one in the administration or in D.C. that's contemplating a federal bailout of Puerto Rico. But we do remain committed to working with Puerto Rico and their leaders as they address the serious financial challenges that are currently plaguing the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. The Treasury Department and other administration officials have been engaged with Puerto Rico to try to help them get access to all available and existing federal resources. And the Treasury Department, over the last year or two, has shared its expertise with local officials in Puerto Rico.
That was White House spokesman Josh Earnest. But what can the Obama administration do? And specifically, you've raised your voice about what it's doing in terms of the healthcare system that could also is related to exactly what the financial crisis occurring now.
It is ironic that candidate Obama came to Puerto Rico to campaign and said that one of the first issues that he wanted to address was the unequal treatment of Puerto Ricans when it comes to access to health care. Here we are, we passed the Affordable Care Act to provide access to health care to all Americans, including the people of Puerto Rico. But when it comes to the funding, Puerto Rico Medicare gets only 60% of the reimbursement rate that the average state gets in the U.S. and 70% of reimbursement for Medicaid. We're talking about a poor economy, and Puerto Rico cannot absorb the difference. This, after Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico pay the same taxes to Medicare and Social Security, so they could start by addressing this issue that will take $500 million from the Puerto Rican government operations money to be able to continue to provide access to care to the Puerto Rican people in the island of Puerto Rico.
And what could Congress do right now?
Well, I believe that the government, the federal government, has the legal authority to address this issue, that we don't have to fix it legislatively.
So you're joining with others now. Do you feel betrayed by President Obama?
I feel that every administration that comes to the White House basically continue to treat Puerto Ricans as second-class citizens, and that is not right. When Puerto Ricans come to war, and participate in any conflict on behalf of this country, they go as American citizens. And it's just not right that veterans in Puerto Rico do not get the same quality health care that veterans here in the United States.
And you've also said that you'd like to see some of the Republican presidential candidates put on the spot on this issue of what to do about Puerto Rico, especially Senator Marco Rubio in Florida, who has a huge, probably the fastest growing Puerto Rican population in the country, in Central Florida.
Definitely. I think that Marco Rubio is going to be hearing pretty soon from the Puerto Rican community in Central Florida. There's no way that a candidate could aspire to get the nomination without winning Florida, or get to win the presidency without winning Florida. And you cannot win Florida without Central Florida, where we have a large concentration of Puerto Ricans. The fact that we don't have, that Puerto Rico do not have the legal authority to use bankruptcy law was not a decision that was made by the Congress. We didn't address that issue at all when we passed the bankruptcy law. So we have legislation that has been filed by Commissioner Pierluisi in the House of Representatives. Chuck Schumer, Senator Schumer, is prepared to introduce the legislation. We need Republican support.
Speaking of presidential candidates, I wanted to ask you about the man who supposedly is #2 in the Republican presidential polls now, Donald Trump. NBC Universal has fired the real estate developer after he made derogatory comments about Mexicans when he announced his bid for the Republican presidential nomination. This is part of what Donald Trump said.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Trump later stood by his statements, and on Tuesday, he sued Univision for ending its contract to broadcast the Miss USA and Miss Universe pageant. Mexico has refused now to send a contestant, and the two co-hosts of the Miss USA pageant, one of them Thomas Roberts of MSNBC, have pulled out. Your response?
Well, shame on Donald Trump. I think that it shows that he's not serious about running for president, because you cannot win in this country with this type of rhetoric. And he could win the nomination of the Republican Party, but when you look at all the battleground states that you need to win, those states are the swing votes in those states. Great portion of that are represented by Hispanic voters. So when you move to the extreme right during the primary, it's going to be very difficult then to move to the center, to be able not to only to appeal to the Hispanic voters, but independent voters. They care deeply about having responsible people at the helm of the White House.